Today I'm going to be pitting the Focus Thron 6.9 and the Specialized Stumpjumper Alloy Comp together to find out which one is the best trail bike. The Specialized Stumpjumper needs little introduction. It retails for £2,500, and in the last year or so the American brand has made some truly tremendous updates to some of their most popular bikes. The Stumpjumper that I've got here is no exception. And in the other corner I've got German brand Focus's all new £3,099 Thron 6.9 trail bike. Focus is arguably less well known, especially in the trail bike market, than Specialized, but their new Thron is a compelling option. The two bikes have some canny similarities as well. They share 130mm of rear travel, the same Fox branded 34 rhythm fork and Float DPS rear shock, and are both designed for trail riding. They even have similar but not identical geometry figures. So how do two seemingly similar bikes compare in terms of spec, value, and how they ride out on the trails? Before I dive in, I'd like to give a shout out to our sponsors Freewheel. If you're interested in any of the kit I'm wearing, check the links in the video description. Now, let's dive into more detail. First up is Focus Thron 6.9 that sits at the top end of the 3-bike Thron lineup. Its 7005 series aluminium tubes have been hydroformed to create a clean but strong look. This is enhanced by the front to back internally routed cables that enter the frame at the stem rather than via cable ports in the tubes that we more commonly see. Focus has called this their Cockpit Integration System, or CIS for short. Now, because there are no external cable routing bosses, should you not want to use their CIS system, it does mean you're locked into using Focus's stem to route the bike's cables. Other details include 2 water bottle cage mounting points inside the front triangle, integrated chain slap protection and mount points for a pannier rack and kickstand on the bike's swing up. Although these are unusual additions, they're present because the Thron's lineup also features a city bike that uses the same frame as this model. The Thron has a 130mm linkage-driven single pivot suspension design. It uses Focus's optimized linkage kinematics and is claimed to be super progressive with plenty of off-the-top sensitivity and bottom-out resistance. Now let's talk about the Thron's geometry. Focus seems to have tried blending agility with stability thanks to a fairly steep 66.5 degree head tube angle and short 435mm chainstays. These are matched with a generous 470mm reach and reasonable 1211mm wheelbase. 75 degree seat tube angle, measured with the seat post set to the same height as the top of the head tube, sounds fairly steep too. Arguably, these figures place it at the conservative end of the trail bike spectrum, however. Spec-wise, Focus has been generous, adorning the Thron with plenty of top-performing parts. Damping duties are taken care of by Fox's 34 Float rhythm fork and Fox Float DPS Performance rear shock. It's running a Shimano XT M8100 derailleur and shifter and crank. This is matched with a lower spec M6100 Shimano Dior chain and cassette. There are Shimano Dior XT brakes with a 4-piston caliper up front and a 2-piston version at the rear. The Rody branded rims on Novatech hubs are wrapped in Maxxis Dissector and Recon tyres front and rear respectively, although neither use the brand's higher performing tackier compounds. What about the Specialized then? How does its spec, geometry and suspension look on paper? Almost totally opposite to the range-topping Thron, this model of the Stumpjumper sits one up from the bottom of the 6-model Stumpy range. The alloy model differs from its more expensive carbon fibre stalemates, and not only because it's made from a different material. Its FSR suspension system uses a horse-link pivot just in front of the rear axle, rather than a seat-stay flex pivot seen on the carbon bikes. And its aluminium construction means it doesn't have Specialized's famous onboard downtube SWAT storage. However, like the carbon bike, it has the same 130mm of travel, 29-inch wheels, and shares the one-sided sidearm strut that spans the top of the top tube and the seat tube shock mounts. When Specialized updated the Stumpjumper in 2020, they applied their S-sizing construction to it. This is where seat tube lengths are kept as short as possible as the reach figure grows. What does this mean for the geometry though? Well, riders of the Stumpy can size up for a more stable bike thanks to those shorter seat tube lengths. And because of the Horselink pivot flip chip, the Stumpy's geometry is adjustable too. This S4 test bike in the low setting has a diminutive 425mm seat tube length, a roomy 475mm reach, and a 615mm top tube. Combine these figures with a 1241mm wheelbase and 444mm chainstays, as well as a 65° head angle and 77.2° seat tube angle, it's clear to see how much potential the Stumpy has. Although 130mm of travel isn't much, Specialized says they've tuned it to perform on any kind of trail, thanks to its progression, where the first part of the travel is soft and supple and the latter portion stiffer to resist bottom mounts. What kind of spec does the $2.5 grand asking price get you? Well, there's kit from a host of big names, and the Stumpy Comp alloy represents great value for money. Up front is Fox's 140mm travel 34 rhythm fork, with grip damper that features external rebound damping adjustment and a progressive compression lockout dial. At the rear is a Fox Float DPS performance shock. The drivetrain is taken care of by SRAM's NX Eagle 12-speed setup. It's fitted with SRAM's G2R 4-piston brakes with 200mm rotor front and 180mm rear. There's a host of Specialized in-house finishing kit, including bar, stem, saddle, and roval wheels wrapped in tubeless ready Specialized Butcher and Purgatory rubber, front and rear, respectively. Finally, it's fitted with an X-Fusion Manic dropper with 170mm of travel. Before I go on to compare how these two bikes ride and eventually select a winner, let's take stock and see how they compare on paper in terms of price, spec, and geometry. Ignoring price and talking in terms of spec only, the Focus Thron would be my preferred choice, but not by a massive margin. Thanks to the Shimano XT drivetrain, coupled with the sheer power of the XT brakes it's fitted with, and the higher spec parts over the Stumpjumper's low-end GX Eagle and G2 Ride stoppers, it's a great choice. From a suspension damper perspective, there's nothing in it. Both bikes share the same fork and rear shock from Fox. The Focus's tyres aren't as good as the Stumpy's though, despite being Maxxis branded. That's because they use the thinnest casing and hardest compounds available. The Stumpy's Specialized tyres use the same T7 and T9 compound grid trail casing seen on their top tier bikes. Factor in price and things get a little more complicated, however. The Stumpy is arguably much better value for money, given that the most expensive parts on both bikes, as I've said before, the fork and shock, are identical. The parts that differentiate the two could easily be replaced and upgraded over time as they wear out. Because, and I think most would agree with me when I say this, they're consumables. In terms of spec and price then, if I had to pick one of these two, it would be the Stumpjumper. What about the geometry then? Well, looking at the figures on paper, this was an easy choice to make. Once again, the Stumpjumper came out on top, but this time it was much more clear-cut. With a slacker head tube angle, steeper seat tube angle, longer wheelbase and chainstays, and a bigger reach, its geometry is more modern and more balanced than the Thron's figures. Although the Thron looks to make some good steps in the right direction, especially its reach figure, its numbers just quite aren't as cohesive as the Stumpy's. So you've heard what I think. Now tell me, what do you reckon is the perfect trail bike? What should its geometry look like? Please let us know in the comments. Now let's get to the juicy bit. How do these bikes ride? Whether I was pointing the Stumpy up or downhill, its chassis was remarkably calm and composed, a trait created by the sum of its geometry, suspension, and componentry working in seamless harmony. When climbing seated, the 77° seat tube angle meant my hips were positioned centrally on the bike over the bottom bracket. This meant pedaling was comfortable compared to bikes with a more rearward position. In contrast, despite the Thron's good looks suggesting it would perform well, its on-trail manners weren't infallible. Riding uphill seated with the seat post at full height, the slack feeling seat tube angle meant my weight was positioned a long way behind the pedal cranks. I found I had to compensate for my rearward position and the front wheel lifting by shifting my weight onto the nose of the bike's saddle and lowering my chin towards the bars. The short chainstays exacerbated the problem by effectively placing me more over the rear of the bike compared to one with longer stays. On the Stumpy, however, my body position wasn't too far forward, and neither was it too far back. The slack and long for a trail bike geometry meant it was confidence inspiring on the downs, and I was able to push it well beyond my expectations of what a 130mm travel trail bike should be able to do. On those same descents, the Thron's biggest prohibiting factor was the fairly steep head tube angle that accelerated the steering and created twitchiness when speeds began to elevate, even if gradients stayed relatively shallow. This caused me to lean further over the back of the bike to compensate, which unweighted the front wheel more, further reducing steering control. To compensate, I ended up running lower rear shock spring pressures to increase sag and slacken the head tube angle out. However, it has to be said, both bikes have impressive suspension. The Specialized was supple yet supportive and absorbed smaller chattery bumps well and created plenty of traction on rougher terrain. Thanks to the frame's progressive kinematics, it didn't sag deep into its travel on steep ascents and also resisted bottoming out when I rode over deeper and wider holes. Arguably, the Thron suspension had to be its best asset. It was impressively progressive, despite it being run softer than it should be, and it resisted bottoming out well when I was clattering down a rough section of trail centre. There was also plenty of mid-stroke support, which helped make the Thron easy to pop from one line to the next. It was also supple at the start of its travel, even when I was running less sag, which helped create plenty of grip. Slacker head tube angles wouldn't take away much from its peppiness, however, and in my eyes would create a net benefit. Still on the Thron then, its thin casing, hard compound Maxxis tyres were fine in the dry on most surfaces, except loose rock where they felt undamped, but did struggle to find traction in damp, greasy or wet conditions. For the asking price, I'd expect chunkier and grippier rubber. Compared to the Stumpy's Butcher and Eliminator combination, that were great on trail centre style runs regardless of the weather, and had plenty of carcass strength for a trail bike. The Focus struggled to perform. The biggest frustration from the Focus's kit was the dropper post lever that I couldn't adjust far enough outboard to operate with my thumb without moving my hand on the bars. To fix this problem, Focus could look at supplying it with a dedicated bar clamp rather than relying on Shimano's iSpec EV system. On the Stumpy, the Guide G2 brakes perform well and offers good levels of stopping power, but weren't as powerful as the Focus's XTs. The dropper post had plenty of travel and its lever was easy to reach without moving my hand on the bars. Both bikes suffered from the well-reported Flexi Fox 34 chassis that caused them to tuck or twist when loaded up in sharp turns with steep run-ins. The simplistic damping meant that they struggled to support my weight in its mid-stroke without needing higher spring rates than recommended too. Depending on how you ride, you might want to consider a fork upgrade down the line for either bike, but that is a seriously expensive thing to do. So, what's the verdict then? The Focus Thron, despite its higher asking price, still represented fair value for money, and it was great to ride on flatter, slower speed trails. Unfortunately, the steeper than average head tube angle meant it turned into a bit of a handful when things got marginally gnarlier. It's a good looking bike though, and its rear suspension performed well, offering plenty of support whilst remaining supple. Arguably, the Stumpjumper Alloy Comp offers fantastic performance for the money, even compared to lighter, more illustriously spec'd and expensive bikes. Not only was the Stumpy a total hoot to ride on pretty much anything I could point it up or down, but it also felt incredibly refined, exuding quality and smoothness worthy of a much higher price tag. Out of these two bikes, I couldn't recommend the Stumpjumper Alloy Comp enough. But it's not all about my opinion. What do you think about these two bikes? Would you rather the peppy ride and higher spec of the Focus Thron? Or do you think you'd prefer the calm and composure of the Stumpy, along with its lower price tag? Please let us know in the comments, and as always, don't forget to like and subscribe and hit that little bell icon so you get a notification every time we upload a new video.